Now that we've covered the basics of sample planning, we're going to talk through the process called data quality objectives. This is what the state of Ohio has set up in state regulations as the process for sample planning, where that data is going to be submitted to the Ohio EPA or a similar organization. Data quality objectives, or DQOs, are defined in the Ohio Administrative Code. They're both qualitative and quantitative statements that come from this data quality objective process that will clarify the study objectives. So specifically, what are we looking to find? What does our data need to, what problem does or question does our data need to answer? We need to know what the appropriate types of data are. We need to know the tolerable levels of decision errors. We'll talk about this a little bit again, but really this is the consequence of getting something wrong. So if our data suggests one action and we follow what the data says, but that action is wrong, what are the consequences of this? So one example may be closing a beach due to high E. coli levels. If we get that wrong, that could have human health impacts. And so our tolerable level of decision error is low for something where there's a human health impact. Whereas in a situation where there may not be a human health impact, or we're merely monitoring something that's not really, that may be an aquatic life impact or something like that, our tolerable decision error may be higher. So that will then be the basis for establishing the quality and the quantity of the data needed to support that decision. So overall, this is the planning process for ensuring that data are the type, quality, and quantity needed for decision making. The data quality objective process is a strategic planning approach that's based on scientific method, and we do it to prepare for data collection. So it should be a systematic procedure for determining the criteria that a data collection study design should satisfy. So we need to determine when to collect samples, where to collect samples, what that tolerable level of decision error is for the study, and how many samples to collect. And that determination of how many samples to collect ends up being a balance of risk and cost. So, of course, we always want to say, more data is going to be better, but of course, all data has a cost associated with it, whether it be analytical cost in a lab, or personnel cost to collect those samples, or cost to then analyze and communicate that data. So we want to use this data quality objective process to ensure that our data collection process ends up achieving two major goals: that we have sufficient data to make the required decisions within reasonable uncertainty, and that we've only collected the minimum amount of necessary data so that we don't spend more money than we need to. So we're balancing resources with making that decision with appropriate quality data. So knowing that we're never going to be 100% certain of our decision, and knowing that we don't have infinite resources, we need to start in this data quality objective system step by step. So this is going to help us formulate the problem, identify what decision will be made using our data, specify the quality requirements for the decision and for the data, and develop a defensible sampling and analysis plan. So we start this by stating the problem, then identifying the decision, identifying inputs to that decision, defining the boundaries of our study, developing a decision rule. So that's fancy words for saying how will we make the decision to close a beach or not close a beach, or to change the use designation of a water body, for example. Specify limits on decision errors, so how bad it would be if we get it wrong, and then optimize the design for obtaining that data. We'll talk through each of those steps now. To start the data quality objective process, we first need to state the problem. So the purpose of this step is to clearly define the problem that requires new environmental data so that the focus of the study will be clear and unambiguous. So we need to identify the activities. So what activities are happening that we're creating a decision around, identify the members, so who are the stakeholders who may either have influence about the decision that we need to make, or who may have data to contribute, or who may be part of collection of data. We need to identify who the decision maker is, develop a description of the problem that's agreed upon by the stakeholders, specify what resources we have and what the deadlines are. So from this step, we should have a concise description of the problem, a list of the planning team members and identification of who the decision maker is, and a summary of available resources and relevant deadlines for the study. So basically, this is identifying what's the problem and why are we concerned. To define the problem, we then need to identify the decision. So this is defining what decision the data will influence. So in this process, we need to state that decision, and we'll talk in a minute about what that decision may be. We need to categorize multiple decisions, so there may be multiple facets to the decision that we make, or multiple endpoints that we may get to. State actions or outcomes that could result from the resolution of the decision. So what could happen if we make a certain decision? So one of the biggest ones, again, is closure of a beach. So if we have high E. coli levels, then you create no contact warnings or beach closures, which then has an influence on tourism dollars, for example. You may also, put contact warnings where you're not closing a beach, but where you're suggesting that vulnerable populations like children and elderly people shouldn't go in the water. So there may be multiple decision points. Alternatively, you may be collecting data about what type of treatment system to install or whether to install treatment. And so again, there may be multiple decisions to be made about whether to treat, and if you're going to treat, what type of treatment you might install. The outputs from this step would be a statement of the decision that needs to be resolved using the data in order to address or solve the problem that we already stated. And then a list of possible actions or outcomes that could result from each resolution of the decision statement. So what are the potential outcomes of one type of treatment versus another, or the outcomes of closing a beach, for example. So essentially, this is a plan of what's needed to address or solve the problem. We now need to identify what the inputs are to our process and to our data collection campaign. So we need to identify what information is needed to make our decision. So what information is required? What are the sources for that data or sources for each item? There may be some existing or historical data that we could identify in this step. We need to identify what information is needed to establish an action level for the study. So, do we have sufficient historical data? Is there data being collected already, or do we need to collect more data? And then we need to confirm the appropriate field sampling techniques and analytical methods and ensure that those exist. There are, certainly new compounds that come up, and certain labs that can only analyze for certain things, and so we need to ensure that we have appropriate field and analytical techniques to gather the type of data that we need. So our outputs from this step would be a list of informational inputs needed to resolve our decision, and a list of environmental variables or characteristics that we're going to measure. Basically, this should be the field and lab parameters that need to be measured and whether those are realistic. Now we need to define the boundaries of our study area. This is boundaries both in time and space. This is particularly important because we're balancing resources. We're balancing the cost with the data that we need to make an appropriate decision at the right level of decision error. So first, we need to define our geographic area. We need to specify characteristics that define a population of interest. So this could be what type of streams that we're looking at, or this might be sampling fish of a certain species, or this could be an area of a lake that's used for recreation, for example. We need to define the scale of decision making, determine when to collect data. We have to determine the time frame to which the study data apply. So, taking one sample in the middle of the summer to characterize water quality may not be appropriate to apply across the whole year. And we need to think about, our flow regimes and whether we need high flow and low flow sampling or seasonal sampling or monthly sampling. And each of those would, apply, each of those data would then apply to different time periods. And we really need to think about the characteristics of the water body in terms of when those samples and when that data would apply. We then need to identify any practical constraints on data collection, things like access or the timing and availability of equipment, any holding times on certain analyses. So things like, a bacterial analysis has a very short holding time. It needs to be analyzed within about 6 hours. And so if the lab doesn't accept samples on Friday, we need to know that so that we can constrain our sampling. The outputs from this step should be characteristics that define the domain of the study, a detailed description of the spatial and temporal boundaries of the decision, a list of any practical constraints that might interfere with the study. So basically, this comes out with the area of the study and the time frame and a schedule for. We then need to state the decision rule. So this should be a single statement that describes the logical basis for choosing among alternative actions. So what that means is, if the data shows this, then what action will we take? That's what the statement needs to be. We have to specify what our key parameters for making a decision are, specify an action level for the study. So for example, if E. coli levels in this lake are above a certain concentration, then we will close the beach. If the fish population doesn't meet standards, then we will remove a low head dam. If the acidity of this discharge is above a certain concentration, then we will treat with lime. We combine those outputs of the previous data quality objective steps into if-then statements that help decide between alternatives. So we already know our boundaries, we know what parameters we're going to analyze for. So we then combine those into how we're going to make a decision that addresses the problem that we've stated. So the output from the step is an if-then statement or several if-then statements that define the conditions that would cause a decision maker to choose among alternative courses of action. Always, we have to acknowledge and accept and try to quantify that there is error in all sampling that we do and all characterization that we do. We are never going to be 100% sure of our data or of the decision that we're making. And so we need to identify what the limits are and the appropriate limits are on errors. So firstly, we need to know the possible range of parameters of interest. We want to define types of decision errors and identify those consequences. So for example, one of the easiest examples that I've used multiple times is whether to close a beach or not due to E. coli contamination. So the type of decision error there is, well, if we leave the beach open when it should have been closed, the possible consequence or the potential consequence of that is that people would get sick. We want to specify the range of possible parameter values and where the consequences of decision errors are minor. So, there's going to be, for example, E. coli levels that are high enough that we're not near a gray area that we know that we need to close a beach. Or there are going to be E. coli levels that are so low that we know we don't need to close a beach, for example. Or we may have other decisions where we don't really where we have data that's outside of that gray area. So we need to know that range where really we're in a gray area where the decision could go either way. So we need to check those limits on decision errors to ensure that they accurately reflect the decision maker's concern about relative consequences for each type of decision error. So if you've got a major human health impact of making the wrong decision, and there's a high error on the data that you're making that decision with, then our error rate and our consequence of making the wrong decision don't match up, and we need to make sure that those match up. So the outputs from this step ought to be that the decision maker's acceptable decision error rates are based on a consideration of the consequences of making the incorrect decision. So after we've gone through all the other steps of the data quality objectives process, we want to then optimize the design. So we're looking for a resource-effective sampling and analysis design to generate data that meets all of the objectives that we set out in the previous steps. So we're going to start by reviewing environmental data, existing environmental data. We don't want to reinvent the wheel. Part of this really is about resource effectiveness, and so we don't want to have to create new data when there's appropriate data there already. We want to develop general sampling and analysis design alternatives. So what ways could we collect data that would tackle the problem in an appropriate way within the error bounds, for example. And then we want to select the most resource-effective design that satisfies all of the data quality objectives. So we want to make sure that it answers the problem, that it's within appropriate decision error, that that we can actually answer the problem and make a decision based on the data that we collect. So from this, we should be coming up with the most resource-effective design for the study that's expected to achieve the data quality objectives that we've developed through this process, selected from a group of alternative designs generated during this step. So through this process, it's a pretty structured way of developing a study plan or developing a sampling plan that meets the Ohio Administrative Code. We are now going to talk about water quality and some of the basics around water quality that can then inform some of the methods for achieving a sampling plan like this.